Bom, vamos iniciar o nosso bate-papo aqui informal. Antes de passar a palavra a vocês, quer dizer, na audiência, eu perguntaria, talvez, ao professor Helpman e... should I speak in English or? Yeah, sure. Okay, let's shift to English. Before giving, the microphone to, the audience, what I'd like to ask is, whether you or, Professor Cukierman have any comments or any doubts on on Octavio's presentation, concerning Brazil. Skip this part. Okay, let's go.
Okay. First of all, I would like to say that, not being a Brazilian, I found it very informative about what was on in Brazil. I think that I was impressed by the fact that in spite of the fact that foreign trade as a fraction of GDP does not seem to be a very large fraction of GDP in Brazil, it still has quite an impact on the rate of growth. In other words, the belief is that, and I wonder if you could elaborate on why this is so. Brazil is a relatively closed economy, and in spite of that, what happens in the world has a substantial impact. The other thing is the notion that one has about Brazil, that Brazil is a country that has that suffers from or has suffered in the past from a lot of inequality. And I understand that there have been many steps that have been taken and that there was an improvement in this direction. But maybe you could say something about some measures of how much improvement there has been, let's say, during the last 10 years, and whether you are satisfied with that, or whether there are other steps that should or need to be taken. Well, it's more like a question.
Okay.
In English or in Portuguese?
Whatever.
Hello. To be frank, in fact, Brazil is very dependent on China. This is the fact that our exports are very sensitive to our GDP is very sensitive to our exports. This is the big correlation between the Brazilian exports and the Brazilian GDP. Brazil is becoming chemical dependent on China. It's impressive. Brazil in the recent years, China became in the recent years the largest trade partner for Brazil in exports and imports. And China became the largest foreign direct investor in Brazil in the last 3 years. Invest in Brazil $13 billion per year.
I would also add that in terms of overall GDP, in fact, trade is a small part. If you count imports and exports, they're about 20% of GDP.
23%.
Yeah, 23%.
Include exports and imports.
In relation to the industrial sector, trade is very important in the industrial sector because industries are 20-something% of GDP, and most of our imports are really raw materials, capital goods, or consumption goods that compete with our industrial goods. So when you compare just with relation to the industrial sector, it's a very big percentage, and the crisis that we are having is more concentrated on the industrial sector than in the agribusiness or in the service. Actually, agriculture has benefited from from China for the commodity price, as you said before.
I would compliment Brazil. Brazilian exports to Argentina is very, very relevant, very important. And our exports to Argentina dropped a lot in the recent years because of the protectionism in Argentina. And coming back to welfare state in Brazil is the largest welfare state among all developing economies. In our vision, this is a process started by Cardoso and followed by Mr. Lula and Mrs. Dilma Rousseff. It's a very successful process in Brazil. We included, I would say, 50 million people in the consumption market in Brazil. The big challenge from now on is the productivity in the Brazilian economy. This is the single most important priority for Brazil, is to increase the productivity. We succeeded in improving in terms of education in the recent years. We have a problem of quality of the education, but we are improving in many fields, but the productivity is crucial to preserve this recent spectacular improvement in the social conditions in Brazil. This is in our vision. At the same time, we need to avoid the middle income trap. You know, the fact some countries succeeded in reaching a certain level of quality of life, but after this, it's impossible to catch up. And it happened in Malaysia and other Asian countries. And we need to avoid the same problem in Brazil. This is my vision, the priority.
If you look at the source of growth, just to complement, savings ratio is still low in Brazil, as Octavio had shown. Instead of 25% of investment, we are having about 20 or even less. If you look at human capital, education is improving, but slowly, and the demographic bonus is ending, as Octavio also showed, because natality rates, birth rates are down, and total factory productivity has been going at less than 1% per year. So it's not. So we need to improve that in order to increase growth. Look at the source. Professor Helpman.
Since the issue of trade has been raised, I would like to take 5 minutes and make some comments about the sort of broader implications of the financial crisis for trade and growth, okay, if I may. So the sort of prolonged financial crisis in Europe and what you might call the dwindling recovery in the US, I think that they affect economic activity around the globe, and they impact many countries in a very negative way. I showed you at the beginning of my presentation this morning the graph from the World Trade Organization about the evolution of trade and how it collapsed with the financial crisis and hasn't really recovered to its old development path until this very day, and the projections are that it will not recover later. And as I pointed out also, this results a situation whereby countries which didn't suffer directly from the financial crisis because their banking system was sound, because their financial markets didn't depend very much on derivatives, they still suffer very much from the financial crisis through the collapse of trade. Now, trade and foreign direct investment have been very important for very long, and they have become much more important in the last few decades. Many countries depend on them now that they didn't depend to such an extent in the past. And this has a lot to do with the way the world economy has developed in response to the major technological change that has taken place with the IT revolution and what followed from it. So if you think, for example, about the NICs, many of you are too young to remember, but the newly industrial countries of Asia, they were the rage of everybody in the 70s and 80s. So how did they grow? Most of them followed a growth path where essentially, which is similar to what China has done, which is to move resources from the rural area to manufacturing. And because in manufacturing productivity was higher, just by resource reallocation, they could grow. But this sort of growth process was limited by diminishing returns, as we know, in many industries. And those who managed to integrate into the world economy and access world markets, they avoided this diminishing return constraint, and they grew much faster. This is what Korea did, this is what Taiwan did, Singapore, Hong Kong, and followed many countries of this. Now, what happened was, with the IT revolution, many of the production processes changed. And many companies then started to offshore and outsource and basically chop up the value chain in many ways, and to distribute production not only outside the company, but also to other countries. Now, why was this important? Because this enabled now countries which went through a process of development with this sort of traditional transformation to specialize rather than in industries, to specialize in certain narrow activities. And as a result, we obtained a sort of supply chain that has become worldwide. And with this worldwide supply chain, countries could specialize in narrow activities and do very well for a while, and they didn't have to build up entire industries. Now, what this has done is it generated very extreme dependence of individual countries on what's happening in the world economy. And this extreme individual dependence shows up very clearly with this financial crisis. In particular, they are very dependent on the technological leaders who are in the US and Europe for the most part. And if this leadership doesn't continue, then they will not be able to grow, because this is essentially what they depend on. Now, if you cannot depend on the technology leaders, then it means that you have to invest much more in education, you have to invest much more in R&D in order to raise your own productivity. And as a result, it's sort of surprising that a lot of the discussion of what's happening now in the world economy is focused on finance and macroeconomic issues, but rather little on these issues, which are paramount for the growth prospects of many of the less developed and middle-income countries. So my view of the world is, the problems in Europe are mostly political. It's a question, who is going to pay the price? So the Greeks want to argue that their governments accumulated debts, but they were illegitimate debts that they accumulated, and then why should they pay them now, right? And the French want to shift the burden of adjustment to the Germans, and the Germans want to shift the burden of adjustment to the French. And there's a very complicated dance that slows down the entire world economy. And what's happening is that all these countries, they don't consider the externalities that they impose on the entire world trading system, and they hurt the growth prospect of many other countries. So this is quite discouraging, I must say, that these big issues, which are so important for so many other countries, are basically disregarded. So what is my sort of short view? When I think about the US, I'm mildly optimistic that after the elections, the sort of political tensions that brought to a stall in pursuing the policies that the US needs in order to recover will be probably resolved at least to a large degree. But in Europe, things are much more difficult because there are all these countries involved, and they have to find a formula not only how to build a fiscal system that will provide stability to the countries in the euro era. They also have to find a system that will distribute the burden sharing in a way that's acceptable to them. And this second thing is much more difficult, and for this reason I'm significantly less optimistic about Europe. And the problem is that we will all pay the price. And this is the bottom line.
Well, thank you, Professor Helpman. Maybe now we should open. Okay. All right.
I would like, this was very interesting, and I would like to complement what Elhanan said with a few remarks about Europe. That, as you said, I think correctly, that the problem there is political, and a problem also of structure. if Europe was like the US with one monetary authority and also one fiscal authority, the problem would have been easier. It hasn't been easy in the US, even with one fiscal authority and one monetary authority.
Because there are two political parties.
There are two political parties. But in Europe, the problem is compounded tenfold or something like that, because we have, one monetary authority, the Europeans and the European, basically the euro area, and 17 fiscal authorities. And those 17 fiscal authorities, they basically are national governments. They value their sovereignty and things like that. And they have been elected by their own electorate, so they feel responsible, and rightly so, from their point of view, to their own constituencies. And each one of them, I think correctly from their point of view as political actors, they want to minimize the burden sharing on their own countries. Now, as Elhanan has said, there is a serious wider problem here, not only at the level, certainly at the level of the world, but even at the European level. They understand that if they don't, the leaders at least, of the main countries, they understand that there is a very substantial externality and a free rider problem that each country wants to pay as little as possible and to get as many benefits from the from the union as possible. But basically, there are two main problems. One is that there is this fiscal, this fiscal decentralization and monetary centralization. This is one issue. The second issue is that when the European Central Bank basically has been, like they say in the Bible, that man has been created in the image of God, and the ECB has been created in the image of the Bundesbank. The Bundesbank was a very conservative central bank, and its main objective was price stability, elevated above all other objectives. And it is similar for the ECB. So it is very difficult for the ECB, that is bound by the Maastricht Treaty, that basically has the power of the same power as the Treaty of Rome, to actually act on a completely different mandate, which is basically the mandate of price stability for the entire euro area. But this is something that the framers of the Maastricht Treaty that created the European Central Bank didn't think too much about. They thought mainly about preserving price stability. So those are the two main problems. But the first one, the political one, I think, is the more important one. Now, the leaders of Germany and France and some other major countries in Europe, I think they understand that. But, and I would like to say just a couple of words about the politics of the whole issue, because the politics is what is going to, ultimately, push the card this way or that way. And that is that, although they understand those things, they are bound by their own constituencies. If they move too much in the direction of bailouts, and in order to preserve the euro area, then they may lose the support of their own constituencies. And this is why my belief is that, as a forecast, what is going to happen is that this sort of lingering crisis in the euro area is going to linger further for quite a while, unfortunately. And that at each step, that is the leaders of the euro area, they understand that there is a very important public good to be preserved here, that a breakup of the euro area, either a small break, if Greece leaves, this is not the end of the world. Greece is only 3% of the GDP of the euro area. But if there is a bigger breakup, the consequences, I think, first of all, for the European easy area are going to be quite substantial, and also, obviously, for the rest of the world by implication. So they understand that, but there is a limit, political limit, because of their own constituencies that do not always understand that and do not also want to understand that for those who understand it. And so my belief is that, as a prediction, is that what is going to happen is that the leaders of the EZ area are going to, at each juncture, they are going to make the least effort that is necessary in order to preserve the European Monetary Union project. But they are not necessarily going to take fundamental steps reform. There will be maybe a partial movement towards fiscal unification. There will not be a full fiscal unification like there was in the United States 200 years ago, when the federal government took upon itself the debt of all the states of the United States, and in return actually got the privilege to collect taxes, took it away from the states. I don't think that such a fundamental reform is going to happen in the foreseeable future in Europe.
Okay, thank you, Professor Cukierman. Before the audience, Octavio, would like to, one quick, please.
No, just, I lived in Europe for 8 years in my professional and intellectual life, and I was in Europe working in OECD during the creation of the euro, the single currency. I remember very well the beginning of this process. It was very interesting. And since the beginning of this process, everybody recognized that the single currency is the most, I would say, extraordinary civilizatory experience. Is in my vision, it's fascinating, this process we are observing right now, the creation of this kind of new governance, new budgetary federation in Europe. I think we need to understand that this is a complex process, inevitable process, but it's a political process. Eurozone is not optimal monetary zone, but is an optimal political zone in my personal understanding. And this is the reason I have a less skeptical reading on what will happen in Eurozone. I think this building process of this new governance is on the good track, and this is in my vision, it could take more 5-10 years, but they will succeed in reaching this target.
Okay, thank you, Octavio. Now questions, Peter.
Well, I'm much less optimistic than you, Octavio. When I see what has been done so far, both in austerity in the problem countries and in contribution by the German and by the other countries, we already are seeing an exhaustion of the austerity process on one side and an exhaustion of the willingness to support on the other. The question I have for you guys, it seems to me that it would be much less painful for the world and eventually for Europe to face the problem and keep the free market and the free movement of capital, people, and goods, but go for the total breakup and every country goes back to their currency. That would be, the same way that you put it together, if by some criterias, you could unwind that, because I really don't see that having the Germans tell what the French can spend will work. It's not going to work. So I think it would be much less painful, and probably because of it's a huge task to unwind the currency, and that's the reason why you keep pushing it forward and forward and forward. And as you all said, I think this will be worse for the world. So my question to you guys is, why can't you face that issue and do that? Wouldn't that be much better?
Much better? That's a great question. Maybe we'd like to say something on that. I have my views, and but
Well, I think it depends very much what you think about the European project. You know, Attali's vision was a project which, through economic integration, leads eventually to political integration. And if this vision doesn't materialize, then one may well want to dismantle the Eurozone.
You know, this was done with the assumption of fiscal responsibility. The assumption is no longer valid, you know?
I'm old enough to remember the debates about the European Union and the monetary union at the time. And everything that's happening now was predicted by a variety of economists. You know, there are no surprises, actually, in what's happening. The question was whether Europe would be able to live with the system through a long enough period of time until it will lead to more political integration so that they will be able to handle the situation. And the crisis came just too soon from this particular perspective. So, but you know, there are simpler answers to the questions that came up during this crisis. So I remember, for example, when the Greek crisis began, in sort of lunch conversations with other economists, we all agreed that the best strategy would be to let Greece fail, and this would have hit, obviously, German and French banks, which were exposed to Greece. And it would have been cheaper to refinance the banks than to refinance Greece. I'm not sure that every economist would have agreed to this, but many of my friends and we thought that this would have been a much more reasonable path to take. But again, obviously, they didn't take this particular trajectory, which is quite unfortunate. And it has to do with the politics of this situation and the vision that some politicians or many politicians have with respect to the future of Europe. And the question is, what price are you willing to pay for this vision? I'm afraid that the world economy actually is going to pay a very high price, as will Europe, obviously.
Portugal, Estonia, and some other countries, they are managed. Of course, they are small economies, and they know the problems of Spain are perhaps much bigger, but to some extent it's working. And second is, I'm not sure it's much easier said than done to break up the euro, because the problems are going to be tremendous. I mean, you can think of companies that have debts in euros, and then all of a sudden became debts in drachmas or pesetas or something like that, francs. How are going to solve all this? The thing. I mean, the system is tremendously integrated at the moment. So if you simply want to change one currency into different currencies, the problems will be horrendous. So I'm not sure if that is an economic solution which is better than going through the pain of continue as it is and doing some austerity and adjusting in time. But I don't know, Octavio would like to say something?
Yeah. I respect your vision, but I disagree strongly. Yeah. I think, as I said before, is a political project, and I don't believe in any kind of creation of some kind of treasury secretary in the Eurozone, but I think it's totally feasible. A budgetary federation based on Brussels, and some new governance to establish some new criteria and new ways of enforcement of this fiscal responsibility. But again, I think Germany was the country, the most beneficiary of this process. The benefit is extraordinary in terms of transaction costs, in terms of decision-making process by companies, by European companies, and the yes, and at the same time, don't forget that during the last 21 years, the average growth in Europe was 1.7%, and to have 2, 3 consecutive years around zero, like in France, or I'm referring to France and Germany, the pillars of the Eurozone, it's nothing, I would say, relevant. It's not a problem. It's not a big challenge. The big benefit of this, the growth is mediocre, okay, I agree, but the volatility of the GDP in Eurozone, in Europe as a whole, is very low compared to US, for example. And I think the European people is much more prepared to absorb this kind of, except in emerging countries in Europe like Greece. But Portugal, as you said, is performing very well. Ireland is the same. And even in the case of Greece, my personal intuition, and based in some talks with my friends in the European Commission, I think they will do what is possible to keep Greece in the project, and probably in, I don't know, in 10 years, Greece will benefit of some kind of Marshall Plan because Greece is there because it was necessary to be there. In my understanding, I respect your vision, but I think it's not a big challenge.
And I hope you're right.
Yes, this is my vision.
Okay, Professor Cukierman.
I just would like to add a couple of things and then to say something of my own. First of all, one of the difficulties in breaking up is that the European, the EMU is a system. Is a system of central banks. Now, those central banks, they have, they're giving credit to each other. Now, because Germany has actually experienced during the last decade much lower increases in unit labor costs than countries at the other extreme like Greece, but also all the others, it has actually accumulated balance of payments surpluses vis-a-vis the other countries. And as a result of that, and the counterpart of that, the financial counterpart of that, is that the other central banks in Europe owe the Bundesbank something like several hundred billion euros, something like that. So now if they break up, this system, the first hurdle that they will have to, this is an immediate hurdle that they will have to face, is to decide, how they are going to reallocate those things. This is not a small matter, because, that is, who is going, how those, and all that has been integrated into an automatic payment system. I forget the name. It's an acronym. So everything is automatic. You don't actually even see those. But but if they break up, you will have to, you will have to bring it up. But as far as the wider picture is concerned, although I do agree that it's going to take probably 5-10 years. This is what I saw. I don't know whether this is optimistic or pessimistic, but this is each one of us can have his speak about optimism and pessimism. So, but the possible process. But I remember an old movie that there was it's called Kowalski and the Colonel, and the colonel was a German colonel. Kowalski was his servant, and the colonel was getting up each morning and saying there are only two possibilities. One is to win or to die in honor. And his servant would say there is always a third possibility. And I think what the leaders of Europe are going for is ultimately a third possibility. If you look, for example, at now there is already some movement towards a partial fiscal unification, and I read coming here on the newspaper that this is starting to get ratified through the it has to be ratified by the different governments, by the parliaments and things like that. So there is already a move towards ratification in France. That doesn't mean that there is going to be a full fiscal unification, but there may be a fiscal unification that is going to be limited to all those bailouts that are necessary in order to clean up the mess that has been created by the financial crisis. And this is something that is likely to postpone the problem, to give some breathing space and maybe solve it in the long run if it solidifies, and at the same time allow the European Central Bank, which is a very conservative central bank, to actually take a much larger role in providing the liquidity that is necessary in order to fight short-term problems and allow the fiscal authorities the breathing space that is needed in order to come up to an agreement.
Maybe another question now from the audience? There is. Okay. If there are no questions, I thank you very much, Professor Helpman, Professor Cukierman, Octavio de Barros. Thank you all for coming. Okay, good day.